Now, after 40 days of war, multiple ultimatums, and a last-minute ceasefire, U.S. and Iran are set to hold diplomatic talks aimed at establishing long-term peace.
Well, the high-stakes engagement comes as fragile truce between U.S. and Iran enters its third day. The stage is set in Islamabad, but a lot of ground still remains to be covered. The Strait of Hormuz, Israeli strikes in Lebanon, and Iran's enriched uranium. These are some of the main sticking points.
Iran's 10-point plan includes a list of demands that U.S. has refused to accept in full. The American demands include Iran opening up Strait of Hormuz and abandoning its nuclear weapon ambition. Israel, on the other hand, wants Iran to end its support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis.
Both sides are dispatching their top officials to Islamabad. The American side will be led by Vice President JD Vance. He will be joined by Trump's two trusted negotiators, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and advisor Jared Kushner. Meanwhile, the Iranian side is expected to have the country's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and Speaker of the Parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf.
First of all, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will host separate meetings with both delegations. The actual negotiations will be mediated by Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar. According to reports, Iranian and U.S. delegation will be sitting in separate rooms. Ishaq Dar and team will work as carrier of messages between them.
Pakistan has emerged as a key mediator between both Tehran and Washington since the onset of war. And this serves Pakistan's interests as well, as Islamabad has mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia. Riyadh's involvement in war would have dragged Pakistan into war with another neighbor. Now, apart from this, prolonged blockade on the Hormuz Strait could drag Pakistan's economy into a deeper crisis.
And owing to the importance of these talks, security has been beefed up in Islamabad's red zone, and local holidays have been declared in for security purposes. Authorities in Pakistan locked down a 3-kilometer zone surrounding the Serena Hotel in Islamabad. Delegations from both nations are expected to stay at the 5-star hotel, which informed all current guests to check out until Sunday.
Now, this will be the first time since 2011 when U.S. Vice President will set a foot inside Pakistan. Last U.S. Vice President to visit Pakistan was Joe Biden in 2011, and this was the same year when U.S. conducted special operations inside Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden. The last U.S. President to visit Pakistan was George W. Bush in 2006.
Now, we are already 3 days into a 14-day ceasefire. Military strikes have stopped, where American troops and Iranian army are still on war alert. And according to reports, Islamabad talks could last for days before any substantial agreements could be reached for the permanent end of war.
Seems like that would be the best thing.
All right, well, to discuss more, we're now being joined live by James A. Russell from Ontario, California. He's an associate professor in Department of National Security Affairs at NPS. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you on our show.
I don't have any audio.
Oh, well, we will
hear you.
Okay, we will get back to you. We'll solve. Are you able to hear us?
I hear you now, yes, thank you.
Perfect, that works. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. Appreciate you coming. We'll begin with, of course, the 10-point agreement that is in place right now. It seems like both the sides are not really agreeing to what this 10-point plan is. Trump is not happy with the Iran, and he's saying that they're doing poor job of maintaining or not opening the Strait of Hormuz. At this point of time, how fragile or stable do you think this ceasefire is?
I don't think it's stable at all, very regrettably, I might add. The United States and its political leadership is displaying the same incompetence and incoherence that have characterized its public pronouncements since the shooting started about a month ago. President Trump said that the Iranian plan provided the basis for discussions, for negotiations, and now here he is, a couple of days later, backtracking on the things that were in Iran's plan, like, for example, control over the Strait of Hormuz, like stopping the shooting in Lebanon. So it's not clear where we are going at this point, except that I would give the talks about a 50-50 chance of actually proceeding. At least, I should say, from the American perspective, at least there is somebody in the delegation that's empowered to speak for the government, which is, of course, the vice president. Witkoff and Kushner have no authority to pass.
Right, Professor Russell, and while there are still a lot of deadlines which need to be addressed, now Lebanon has emerged as the latest contingency, which is, of course, playing out the way it is playing out. Trump has said that Israel is going to be scaling back, while Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that the offensive against Israel, offensive against Hezbollah, is not going to be stopped, and there's no way to disarm Hezbollah by, taking back the military aggression. How do you think that is going to play out in the negotiations or affect it going forward?
I don't think that it is going to play a part in the negotiations, which is to say, I don't think Israel has any intention of ceasing its military operations in Lebanon. Of all the three parties in this bargaining framework, it's in Israel's interests to keep the war going, to keep bombing people. That's their preferred outcome. And I think you may see some kind of temporary agreement in Lebanon, but they're not going to stop the war in Lebanon. They're in the process of annexing southern Lebanon. And the only way that this can stop is if the United States chooses to stop providing the Israelis with ammunition and money and political support. And I think the presence of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff in Islamabad tells you everything you need to know about the American government's predisposition to want to rein the Israelis in. And so, in other words, they're not going to put any serious boundaries on Israeli behavior. And Israel would be happy to wreck the ceasefire in any event.
Professor, I would like to take that forward. Now, what would that mean for Iran? Would Iran choose, because of the Strait of Hormuz is a leverage for them, would they choose that as a point to be able to say that in our negotiations with the U.S., we will want Israel to stop attacks on Lebanon? Because in the end, of course, its axis of resistance contains Hezbollah. What would it mean? Is Iran at crossroads at this point to just defend its own nation or also support Hezbollah at this point?
I think this is, of course, the right question to be asking. And I think my guess is that Hezbollah would stand down if they got the order from the supreme leader in Tehran. And as you say, we go back to the situations that existed when the shooting was going on, which was that Iran retains control over the Strait of Hormuz. When Donald Trump agreed to the Iranian 10-point plan, that was in there. And so now Trump is, of course, claiming that's not what I thought. And so as I said at the outset, it's the same sort of level of incompetence and incoherence on the U.S. side in terms of knowing what's in these proposals and being able to fashion positions. And I should also add that your question brings up this, of course, very salient point, which these are very complex region-wide negotiations with, for example, the situation in Lebanon being among them. And the United States delegation does not have the kinds of detailed expertise and knowledge about these matters that it really needs, because Trump won't allow America's professionals to participate in these discussions. So I think it's kind of highly unlikely that the United States and Iran are going to be able to hammer out the kind of detailed agreement. It's not a deal. I know the president likes to refer to these things as a deal, but what the Iranians want is a comprehensive peace agreement, which means details, it means fine print, it means having delegations in place that can put together the structure of these kinds of things, which are quite complicated and need seasoned professionals, which the U.S. does not have on its team. So here we sit again with the Americans going into Islamabad with its maximalist positions, insisting that the Iranians must essentially surrender everything, And with the Iranians being, well, we've been fighting for the last month, and we've seized control of the Strait of Hormuz, and we want reparations, we want security guarantees, we want all of these things, which of course were not on the table the last time these delegations met. So it's just, again, another example of countries, in this case it's Israel and the United States, thinking that somehow blasting away from 12,000 feet is somehow going to make the political problems less complicated, when in fact it's the opposite. The political problems become more complicated, not less so.
Professor Russell, you've raised a very important point that at this stage in the conflict, it's very important to have that attention to detail and clarity in communication. And we understand that this has become a narrative, a battle of narratives at this point, apart from just being a battle of firepower. And the uncertainty over the Strait of Hormuz continues. And as you've just mentioned, it's a leverage that Iran did not have before the attacks began. And the White House is saying that there is a discrepancy between what the Iranian regime is admitting in public and what it is saying in private. What do you make sense? How do you make sense of these contradictions that are also coming up, especially at this very delicate stage in the conflict?
Well, I think so. Of course, in any negotiation like this, you're going to have public posturing, and then at least in theory, you're going to have actual, real conference room exchanges. When I say conference room, what I mean is subject matter experts trying to work through the mechanics of agreements on the issues that are under discussion. And of course, Iran has an interest in staking out what I would call a maximalist position, as the United States does to a certain extent. But in Iran's case, one of the as you correctly note, I think, the major thing that actually has really changed, one of the many things, but the big thing is the seizure of the Strait of Hormuz by the Iranians and the establishment, of course, of some kind of toll system that countries are going to be forced to acknowledge and participate to use the strait. Of course, now, again, this was in the Iranian proposal that Donald Trump said was the basis for an agreement. Now Trump is claiming that, they have to open the strait to all shipping. So again, we are left with, as you said, these sort of competing narratives. And if I'm in the Iran kind of camp at this point, I would say that they have a significant amount of leverage in strait closure issue, which, as you correctly note, I think, potentially gives them the leverage on several of the other issues at play. But the trouble is, with that, we're thinking about this in classic rational cost-benefit calculus terms. If you're on the American side, and the how to characterize the American side is one, again, of obtuseness and strategic incoherence. Trump claims that he's achieved a great victory when most of the world opinion scratches their head and they can't understand what Trump is talking about half the time. He's talking about wiping out civilizations and using nuclear weapons, and says that opening the strait is someone else's problem, and the next day he's changed his mind, which raises this other problem that the Iranians, they would be sort of quite legitimately confused about this. And how do they trust anything that comes out of the mouth of American officials? I'd be surprised if they met with either Kushner or Witkoff in Islamabad after the treatment they've gotten from both of these guys, who obviously can't be trusted. And the last round of these negotiations clearly were a ruse after Netanyahu and Trump agreed to launch the war. So Iran is they're in a difficult circumstance in terms of whether they actually have a real negotiating partner who can be trusted and who will follow through on commitments, when the behavior of the United States over the last month tells them otherwise. And I should hasten to add, this is not just in Iran, of course. It's in all sorts of political interactions all around the world, like with the NATO allies, for example. So all I can to sort of try to put a positive spin on this is that let's just hope that the American negotiators come to the negotiating table prepared to take yes from the Iranians. It was clear in the last round of negotiations or meetings between them that there was no circumstance under which that Kushner or Witkoff were going to take yes from the Iranians on a number of issues, and they were taking us down the path to war. All we can hope as concerned global citizens is to hope that that is not the case today, that the United States is prepared to actually address Iranian grievances, and all we can do is hope that having someone like Vance on the team will lend itself to this kind of exchange. And just as a brief footnote to the Vance presence, yes. I would commend all of your readers to look at the New York Times piece from 2 days ago about the Trump administration's decision to launch the war against Iran, which came following meetings in the White House between Netanyahu and the Mossad and Trump. And the only person in the Trump administration the only adult on the American side is JD Vance, who's asking questions about what's the purpose of the war, yes. How long is it go, what do we hope to achieve? He's the only adult in the room.
We hear you. Absolutely, we hear you. Of course, JD Vance, but then in the end, of course, that's like one of the things that we see, that of course we have someone who's actually going for this negotiations. On the other hand, what does it mean for Israelis? Because let's talk about the war goals that they had talked about, regime change or the dismantling of uranium. Even if you know what U.S. has said in the agreement is hand over Iran's stockpile of already enrichment to International Atomic Energy Agency. That's some of the points that U.S. has said. But do you think Iran would agree to that? Because now, as you mentioned, and also my colleague had also mentioned about the fact that Iran actually has a lot of leverage with the Strait of Hormuz and a lot of points which they did not have before the war. So in the end, who has the ball now? Because when we look at it, then we also have something that Iran has always been saying, we will not have nuclear energy, which is something they said before the war as well.
Right. So this is again, this returns us to a certain extent to the state of play as it existed before the shooting started, in which, again, the American view was that they wanted essentially to recreate some version of the Obama administration's agreement to limit Iran's peaceful nuclear program that it is entitled to as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The cynics out there, and I might even be among those cynics, would say that the actions over the last month have pushed Iran over the edge. I think it's a virtual certainty that they will probably try to develop a bomb, because they see this as the only way to prevent the additional attacks from either the Israelis and or the United States. In the negotiations, though, that existed or were going on, according to press reports, Iran was again prepared to offer up the enriched uranium, prepared to place it under some form of International Atomic Energy Agency supervision in exchange for relief of sanctions. So I think the point of these negotiations, so to speak, is that Rome is not going to be built in a day, which is to say that they're not going to get through all of these complicated issues in this relatively short amount of time. But the point of such negotiations, drawing from a page of American history with the Soviet Union, for example, in the Cold War, is that you build these agreements piece by piece. And the place to start would certainly be, at least in my opinion, would be the Iran nuclear program, and then the issue of its enriched uranium. Supposedly, the Iranians again say they may be willing to discuss this, although, again,
right.
So
of course, Professor Russell, and the question on everybody's mind is that what would it take for both of the sides to actually achieve a permanent breakthrough, but also what happens if these, if this 2-week window fails to produce one. But of course, we'll have to wait and see. For now, thank you so much, Professor Russell, for joining us in the broadcast and sharing your perspective with us.